So long, farewell, Alvidas, and goodbye. Hi everyone, Goodney by Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new La Dispute record, Panorama. This is the fourth full-length album from Michigan-based emo and post-hardcore outfit La Dispute, a band that separated themselves in their respective genre pretty early on with their incredibly intense, poetic lyrics that built into these emotionally devastating narratives. Also, some pretty dynamic rock instrumentation behind all of this, too. This is especially true of highlights from across the band's discography like Hudsonville, Michigan, 1956, New Storms for Older Lovers, and King Park. It feels like such a long time ago at this point, but the group's last full-length LP, Rooms of the House, was a pretty admirable attempt at I guess taking La Dispute's sound up until that point and condensing it down a little bit, trying to write and record songs that were a bit more to the point. I mean, there were a lot of good tracks and tragic stories on this album, don't get me wrong, but I think this album's full potential was kind of kneecapped by the awkward marriage of Jordan Dreyer's really intense storytelling and just this more straightforward rock instrumentation, both of which just felt really at odds with one another. For a band like La Dispute, more dynamics is probably better than less in most cases, even if it does make the group's records less hooky and immediate. And Panorama seems kind of like a return to that. Fulton Street 1 and 2 add up into a 10-minute emo epic, with Dreyer dropping these heavy lyrical passages about death near the interstate, fading memorials, lost lives forgotten. And it starts so quietly for a La Dispute song, with these gentle chimey guitars softly swelling and growing alongside some soft-spoken words. The track progresses to this great post-rock-ish build-up and eventually reaches an incredible climax with a lot of bite and a lot of drama. Fulton Street 2 carries the momentum of the previous track into some heavier guitar passages. Dreyer is extending these themes of loss and moving on and time passing with snow falling and covering everything. I love the heavy rushes of guitar on this thing, also the sound effects of what feels like just noisy whooshing throughout the mix. It's kind of like the band is recreating the sound of that thick and nasty snow kind of blowing in and taking over everything. It's a pretty great and powerful start to Panorama, and even though when you look at the track listing and the album length of this project, it's nowhere near as grand or even as traumatic a statement as La Dispute's first couple of records, but Panorama is unique in the La Dispute discography in that a lot of the tracks on this thing do connect and transition into one another, not just in a narrative sense, which has been the case for a lot of La Dispute's music up until this point. This results in Panorama being one of the more holistic experiences in the La Dispute discography, which gives me the sense on this album that I'm traveling through an experience or a progression of some sort. The next track, Rhodonite and Grief, seems like a takeoff of the previous two cuts in that we have people depicted on the song in the deep throes of mourning. It seems like they're grieving the loss of a loved one and wanting to die. The track also features this very melodramatic but also hard-hitting refrain of lifetimes live to die. The cut also features this dreary but killer chord progression, a mellow but very sharp guitar line, and some subtle but great horns that add a lot of flavor to the mix too. La Dispute eventually progresses this into a pretty fantastic instrumental bridge and leaves us with a pretty chilling finishing mantra: Rhodonite for stress, promethazine for sleep, a rabbit toy for kids, my deep condolences. Closing words that put our characters in this limbo of dependency to deal with the emotional pain, with one of the two people depicted here taking on a bit more of a caretaker role. The band smartly brings the energy up on the next cut from this thing, Anxiety Panorama, which definitely lives up to the title, with its crashing walls of guitars and drums and shouted lead vocals. Not one of the best emotional ragers La Dispute has ever penned, but certainly one of the best on this record. The band then transitions into some very low-key spoken word on the track In Northern Michigan, which is not a surprise considering how much of the band's discography up until this point has dabbled in that a little bit, or essentially could be boiled down into a not spoken word, but shouted word. Weirdly enough, La Dispute is kind of taking a risk at this point in their discography by playing it so soft and subtle on tracks like these. There's actually something pretty compelling about some of the quieter moments on this record, even if it does kind of come off like something you might hear on an old Me Without You record, but with a bit more tension and drama, especially on this track where you have these droning, swelling, layered ambient tones kind of taking up a lot of the space in the background. After this point on Panorama though, I think La Dispute does start to paint themselves into a corner, even with the band's obvious attempts at bringing more mellow variations into the fold. Instrumentally, Views from Our Bedroom Window does leave a lot to be desired. I feel like the band's written better rock passages than this in the past. It also doesn't help that this track features a pretty standard and run-of-the-mill vocal performance from La Dispute, not to mention the lyrics are kind of underwhelming on this one. They have a lot of flowery language and evocative imagery, but they are very low on emotional and narrative impact. The band loses me once again on the very riffy Footsteps at the Pond, which instrumentally sounds like one of the harder, more edgy tracks off the last Interpol record. The mix is also a total mess. This gigantic distorted swell of guitars in the first leg of the song sounds like a muddled mess. Even though this album continues, I don't really feel like it adds all that much to La Dispute's artistic profile. The only track that I think comes close to stunning in the second half here is the closing cut, which does a great job of tying up a lot of the narrative themes up until this point, from Fulton Street to the traffic to the bedroom window, all of these memories from previous tracks replaying over some distant thuddy drums and splashy acoustic guitars. The song does try to provide a nice moment of finality in the track list here, but hearing a lot of these ideas come back full circle only makes me realize that this has not been the best set of La Dispute songs and stories. The perspectives depicted on this album are nowhere near as memorable or as emotionally cutting as they were on Wildlife. And even if it did feature some weak instrumental moments, Rooms of the House was much more spellbinding, lyrically. It also does not help that the closing track on here instrumentally does not progress all that well. I think it kind of ends up spinning its wheels in the mud in the second half. The vocals, even as they get shoutier and a bit more intense, just end up getting lost in the washed out acoustic guitars. It's kind of anticlimactic, honestly. Still, this is not necessarily a bad record from La Dispute. I can understand hardcore fans being into it, but for someone who's been listening to their music for a while now, it feels like we're reaching a point where their idiosyncratic style is becoming an albatross around their necks. They can't seem to drift away from it because when they do, the results are usually awkward, and yet the more they draw it out, the less they seem to get out of it. I'm feeling a decent 2 strong 6 on this one. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, La Dispute, Panorama, forever.